All right, you ready to dive in?
Always. What do we got today?
This time, we're going deep into some pretty complex stuff. Global finance, geopolitics, the fun stuff.
Sounds right up our alley.
Well, it all started with this article someone sent us about Trump, threatening those 100% tariffs on BRICS nations.
That's got some serious implications. Way bigger than just a trade spat, actually.
That's what we're here to figure out, right? Because honestly, at first glance, I was like, okay, tariffs, whatever. But then I started reading and
this is about way more than just Trump and some trade war.
Exactly. So for our listeners who haven't gone down this rabbit hole yet, let's back up a bit. What's the big picture here?
The big picture is that the U.S. dollar, the mighty dollar, the one we've all relied on, it might be losing its grip on the global economy.
Whoa, okay. That's a pretty huge statement. And BRICS plays into this how?
BRICS is a big part of this story. We're talking Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they've been adding new members, too. Places like Saudi Arabia, Iran. It's a growing club.
And they're all, united against the dollar?
Not exactly united, but they all have a common interest in lessening their dependence on the U.S. dollar.
So it's like they're ganging up on us.
It's not so much ganging up as it is strategically positioning themselves for a world where the dollar isn't the only game in town. Creating alternatives, you could say.
Okay, so less gang and like a really powerful book club. Reading up on how to ditch the dollar.
Maybe. But seriously, their combined economic power is massive. They control almost a third of the global economy.
That's a huge chunk. No wonder people are paying attention.
Exactly. And that power gives them leverage to start changing the rules of the game.
And one of those new rules is de-dollarization. That word keeps popping up everywhere.
Right. It's basically a fancy way of saying, let's find ways to do business without relying on the U.S. dollar.
So like trading in their own currencies.
Exactly. We're already seeing it happen. Russia and China, for example, are doing more and more business in rubles and yuan.
I did see that somewhere. But is that really having a big impact? I mean, it's still just Russia and China, right?
It's a start. And when you consider the sheer volume of trade between them, it adds up. Plus, it sets a precedent. Other countries are watching.
So it's like a snowball effect.
Kind of. Each deal they make outside the dollar system, it chips away at the dollar's dominance. And it sends a signal. There are other options out there.
So this isn't just Trump being, Trump. There's a much bigger shift happening beneath the surface.
That's the key takeaway here. This isn't just about one president or one policy. This is about the very foundation of the global financial system potentially shifting.
Okay, wow. I'm starting to get why people are freaking out about this.
It's a big deal. For decades, the U.S. has benefited hugely from the dollar being the world's reserve currency.
Right, like everyone needs dollars to buy oil, so we've always got leverage.
Exactly. But what happens if that changes? What happens if countries start using other currencies or creating their own financial systems that bypass the dollar?
Well, that's what I'm hoping we can figure out in this deep dive. But before we go any further, maybe we should introduce the source material we're working with today. So our listeners know where we're getting all this from.
Good point. We're mainly focusing on an episode from the Kwolfs podcast, specifically episode 4, which aired November 12, 2024, titled The Real Stakes Behind Trump's 100% Tariff Threat.
Catchy title.
Yeah.
So Kwolfs, are they like financial experts or something?
More than just experts. They run what they call the world's first live streaming financial derivatives platform. Plus, they're big into AI and wealth growth strategies. So yeah, they're deep in the financial world.
All right, so not your average armchair analysts. They probably have a pretty interesting take on all this dollar stuff.
Oh, they definitely do. And the hosts, Michael and Sherry, they really dig deep into the nuances. They connect the dots between economics, geopolitics, the whole picture.
Yeah, it's like we've got our work cut out for us then.
We do. But that's the fun part, right? Unraveling the complexities, figuring out what it all means.
Exactly. All right, so back to this Kwolfs episode. Where do they start? What are some of the key things they highlight?
Well, right off the bat, they point out that this whole BRICS thing, it's not just about some future common currency, which, by the way, gets way more attention than it deserves.
So it's more about the stuff that's happening right now.
Exactly. They focus on the existing agreements, the payment systems already in place, all the stuff that's quietly shifting the balance of power.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Sure. They talk about how Russia and China have already shifted a huge chunk of their trade away from the dollar, using rubles and yuan instead.
I guess I hadn't really thought about how much trade those two do together.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And each transaction they make without using dollars, it chips away at the dollar's global dominance.
So even if it's not a coordinated effort, it's still having a cumulative effect.
Precisely. And it's not just Russia and China. The Kwolfs hosts point out that trade within the entire BRICS bloc has been exploding, like a 56% increase between 2017 and 2022.
Wow, 56%.
Yeah.
That's huge. I mean, it clearly shows they're serious about this, right?
Absolutely. They're strengthening their economic ties, building alternative systems. It's a clear signal they're not content to just play by the old rules anymore.
The rules set by the U.S. and the dollar.
Right. And it's not just about trade either. There are these little hints popping up everywhere that things are shifting. Like Saudi Arabia, they're even exploring the idea of pricing some of their oil sales to China in yuan.
Wait, really? Isn't that like the opposite of how things have always worked?
It is. For decades, oil has been the bedrock of the petrodollar system. Everyone needs oil, and they need dollars to buy it. That's given the U.S. incredible leverage.
So if even that starts to change.
It could have ripple effects throughout the entire global economy.
Okay, this is starting to sound less like a book club and more like a full-blown revolution.
Maybe not a revolution, but definitely a serious challenge to the existing order.
All right, so we've got BRICS nations doing their own thing, making their own deals, strengthening their own ties, all while chipping away at the dollar's power. But, like, realistically, how much of a threat is this to the U.S.? Are we really going to lose our top spot?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer that, we need to dig deeper into some of the specifics. Like, what are the actual consequences of this de-dollarization trend? What are the potential risks and opportunities?
And what about those tariffs? Trump's threat to slap 100% on BRICS goods. How does that play into all this?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle, because it's not just an empty threat. It could trigger a chain reaction with serious consequences for everyone.
Okay, yeah, we definitely need to unpack that. But first, I think we need a little break. Give our listeners a chance to digest all this.
Sounds good. We'll be back in a bit to continue this deep dive. All right, so before the break, we were talking about how BRICS nations are, kind of shaking things up, challenging the dollar's dominance.
Right. And I think we left off with the whole Saudi Arabia thing, them maybe pricing some oil in yuan, which just seems crazy to me.
Yeah, it would be a huge deal because remember, oil is traded in dollars. That's the whole foundation of the petrodollar system. It's what gives the dollar so much global clout.
So if even Saudi Arabia, like the oil king, starts moving away from that.
It sends a signal that other countries could follow. Suddenly, the dollar's not looking so indispensable.
Which is exactly what BRICS wants.
Right. It seems that way. And the Kwolfs hosts, they made this really interesting point about how this all ties into the idea of the U.S. weaponizing the dollar.
Weaponizing? And like how?
Well, think about it. In recent years, the U.S. has increasingly used its control over the global financial system to punish countries that don't toe the line.
I see what you mean. Like when they froze all those Russian assets after the Ukraine invasion.
Exactly. And that move, it really spooked a lot of countries, made them realize how vulnerable they were if they stayed too reliant on the dollar.
Because the U.S. could just flip a switch and cut them off.
Pretty much. So countries are looking for ways to insulate themselves, to create some distance from the dollar, so they're not at the mercy of U.S. policy.
And BRICS is offering them a way to do that.
That's how it looks. And the Kwolfs hosts, they argue that technology is actually making this whole process easier.
Technology? Like, how so?
Well, think about all the advances in digital payment systems, blockchain technology. It's making it much easier for countries to bypass the traditional SWIFT system, which is heavily influenced by the U.S.
So they can create their own systems that are outside U.S. control.
Exactly. And the Kwolfs host pointed out that even some traditional U.S. allies are starting to explore these alternatives.
Wow, so this is spreading beyond just the BRICS bloc.
It seems that way. It's like a domino effect. The more countries that move away from the dollar, the less power the U.S. has to dictate the rules of the game.
Okay, this is getting kind of intense.
Yeah.
But let's circle back to Trump and those tariffs for a minute, because that's what initially got us down this rabbit hole.
Right. Good point. Because even if this whole de-dollarization thing is happening gradually, those tariffs, if they actually went into effect, that could be a huge shock to the system.
The Kwolfs episode talked about that, right? What did they say?
Well, they don't sugarcoat it. They point out that we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in trade between the U.S. and BRICS nations, and 100% tariffs on top of that. It would be chaos.
Prices would skyrocket, businesses would be scrambling. It would be a mess.
Exactly. And remember, supply chains are already fragile. The Kwolfs folks actually cite a report from McKinsey that found something like 92% of executives are already trying to make their supply chains more resilient.
So they're already bracing for disruption. Add tariffs on top of that.
It could be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the economic impact either. The Kwolfs hosts talked about how this could further escalate tensions between the U.S. and BRICS, lead to more distrust, less cooperation on global issues.
So it's a lose-lose situation.
It could be. But beyond all that, there's another factor that the Kwolfs hosts highlighted that I think is really important. BRICS nations, they hold a lot of U.S. debt.
Oh, right. I'd forgotten about that. Wasn't it like trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds?
Over $1 trillion, yeah. And if they decide to start selling those off,
Yeah.
dumping them on the market, it could trigger a financial earthquake.
Interest rates would spike, borrowing costs would go up. It would be bad. Really bad.
Exactly. It just shows how interconnected everything is, how actions in one part of the world can have ripple effects everywhere else.
Okay, so we've got all these different pieces of the puzzle now. De-dollarization, tariffs, debt. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around the bigger picture. What does it all mean? Where are we headed?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the Kwolfs episode, they offer a few possible scenarios. But one that they keep coming back to is this idea of a multipolar world.
Multipolar, meaning?
Meaning that the U.S. wouldn't be the sole superpower anymore. Instead of one dominant force calling the shots, there would be multiple centers of power.
So like BRICS would be one power center, the EU another, maybe China on its own?
Exactly. Each with its own sphere of influence, its own trading networks, its own financial systems. It would be a very different world than the one we've known for the past few decades.
Okay, so let's say that does happen, this multipolar world.
Mm-hmm.
What would that mean for, like, regular people? How would our lives change?
Well, the Kwolfs folks, they had some interesting thoughts on that. They said it could mean more choices for consumers, but also more complexity.
More choices, like how?
Well, think about it. If you've got multiple economic blocks, you're not just limited to products and services from one dominant system. You might have access to a wider range of options, different technologies, different cultural influences.
That actually sounds kind of cool, but you said it would be more complex too.
Right, because you'd have to navigate those different systems. You couldn't just assume that everyone plays by the same rules anymore. You'd have to be more aware of the nuances, the different standards, the different currencies.
So like traveling could get more complicated.
Or
Investing.
potentially, even online shopping. Imagine if the internet becomes less global and more fragmented, with different platforms and services dominant in different regions.
Yeah, hadn't thought about that.
It's something to consider, and it highlights the importance of staying informed, not just about what's happening in your own backyard, but about global trends, the dynamics of these different blocks.
So we'd all have to become mini geopolitical experts just to function.
Maybe not experts, but definitely more aware, more engaged with what's happening in the world around us.
Okay, this is giving me a lot to think about. But before we get too lost in hypotheticals, there's one more thing from the Kwolfs episode that I wanted to touch on. China's Belt and Road Initiative. Because they made it sound like that's a key piece of this whole multipolar puzzle.
Oh, absolutely. The Belt and Road, it's like a real-world manifestation of this shift in power, a concrete example of how China is building its own sphere of influence.
They described it as like more than just an infrastructure project, right?
Right. It's a strategic play, a way for China to connect with countries all over Asia, Europe, Africa, create new trade routes, establish partnerships, set standards. It's about shaping the future on their own terms.
And it's working. I mean, they're actually making progress.
They are. Billions of dollars have already been invested, ports, railways, pipelines. It's all happening. And it's connecting China to a whole network of countries, many of them part of BRICS.
So it's like creating a whole new economic ecosystem, one that's centered around China, not the U.S.
That's one way to look at it. And it's definitely something that the U.S. and other Western powers are watching very closely. Because the Belt and Road, it has the potential to reshape global trade, global politics, everything.
Okay, so we've got BRICS challenging the dollar, China building its own network of influence. It sounds like the world is undergoing some pretty massive changes. And honestly, it's a little overwhelming.
I know, right? It's a lot to take in. But that's why we do these deep dives, to unpack these complex issues, to try to make sense of it all.
Because if we don't understand what's happening, we can't prepare for the future.
Exactly. And the Kwolfs hosts, they made this point that it's not about picking sides. It's about understanding the dynamics, the different players, the different forces at play, so we can make informed decisions, whether we're business leaders, investors, or just everyday citizens trying to navigate this changing world.
That's a good point. So we've covered a lot of ground here. De-dollarization, tariffs, the Belt and Road, this whole multipolar world idea. What's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the world is changing. The old assumptions, the old power structures, they're not as solid as they used to be. And that can be a scary thing, but it can also be an opportunity.
An opportunity. How so?
Well, if the old rules are being rewritten, that means there's a chance to shape the new ones, to create a system that's more equitable, more sustainable, more beneficial to everyone.
That's a pretty hopeful way to look at it.
I think it's important to be realistic about the challenges, but also to be optimistic about the possibilities. Because the future, it's not predetermined. It's something we create together.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we do, I just want to remind our listeners that there's still more to come. We've got one more part to this episode where we'll explore some of the potential solutions, some of the ways we can navigate this changing world.
That's right. We'll delve into some practical strategies, some things to think about, some resources to check out, so stay tuned for that.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you back here soon for the final installment of our deep dive. Okay, so last time, things got pretty intense.
We did cover a lot of ground. De-dollarization, the Belt and Road.
Yeah, and that whole multipolar world thing, I'm still wrapping my head around that one.
It's a big concept.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to understand because it really frames everything that's happening right now.
So remind us again, what exactly does multipolar mean?
Basically, it means a world where power isn't concentrated in one place, like it has been for, well, pretty much our entire lifetime.
With the U.S. calling the shots.
Right. But in a multipolar world, you'd have multiple centers of power, each with its own sphere of influence, its own economic systems, its own values.
So not just a U.S. versus China thing, but like a whole bunch of different power centers all vying for influence.
Exactly. Think about it. You could have the BRICS nations forming a powerful bloc, the European Union holding its own, maybe India emerging as a major player. It's a much more fragmented landscape.
And a lot harder to predict.
Definitely. Which is why it's so important to understand the dynamics of each of these potential blocks, their strengths, their weaknesses, their goals.
Because the old playbook might not work anymore.
Exactly. If you're a business leader, an investor, or even just someone trying to plan for the future, you can't just assume that the world will keep operating the way it always has.
So what does this mean for businesses? How do they adapt to a multipolar world?
Well, the Kwolfs host talked about this idea of becoming more agile, more flexible.
Like not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Right. Companies might need to diversify their supply chains, their financial holdings, maybe even have different strategies for different regions of the world.
So it's less about having one global strategy and more about being able to adapt on the fly.
Exactly. Because the rules of the game could be different in each of these economic blocks.
That's a lot for companies to wrap their heads around. And what about for individuals? Like, how would this multipolar world affect our daily lives?
Well, it could mean more choices, but also more complexity. Think about it. If you've got multiple economic spheres, you're not just limited to products and services from one dominant system. You might have access to a wider range of things, different technologies, different cultural influences.
That sounds kind of cool, actually. More options, more variety.
Right. But the flip side is that you'd also have to navigate those different systems. It wouldn't be as simple as it is now.
Like even just traveling could get more complicated.
Potentially. Imagine dealing with multiple currencies, different visa requirements, maybe even different digital ecosystems.
And what about online shopping? Would the internet become less global and more regional?
It's possible. We could see different platforms and services dominating in different parts of the world, which means you'd have to be more aware of what's available where and how to access it.
Okay, so this multipolar world, it's a mixed bag, more choices, but also more complexity.
That's a good way to put it. And it really highlights the importance of staying informed, being adaptable, and maybe even learning a bit about geopolitics.
No more tuning it all out.
Not if you want to thrive in this new world.
Okay, fair enough. So we've got this potential shift towards a multipolar world. But the Kwolfs podcast also spent a lot of time on China's Belt and Road Initiative. How does that fit into all of this?
The Belt and Road is a perfect example of how this multipolar world could play out in practice. It's China's grand plan to build a massive network of trade routes, infrastructure, and influence, stretching across Asia, Europe, and Africa.
It's incredibly ambitious. Billions of dollars being poured into ports, railways, pipelines.
And it's not just about physical infrastructure either. It's about creating economic partnerships, setting standards. It's about shaping the future on China's own terms.
So in this multipolar world, the Belt and Road could become the foundation for a whole new economic sphere, one that's heavily influenced by China.
That's one possible outcome, and it's something that a lot of countries are watching closely. Because the Belt and Road, it has the potential to reshape global trade, global politics, everything.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but that's what we try to do here on this show, right? Unpack these complex issues, connect the dots, and hopefully help our listeners make sense of it all.
Exactly, because knowledge is power, right? Especially in a world that's changing as rapidly as ours is.
So as we wrap up our exploration of this topic, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the world is in flux. The old certainties are fading, and that can be unsettling, but it can also be incredibly exciting.
Exciting. How so?
Well, if the old rules are being rewritten, that means there's a chance to shape the new ones, to create a system that's more equitable, more sustainable, more beneficial to everyone.
That's a pretty optimistic way to look at it.
I think it's important to be realistic about the challenges, but also to be hopeful about the possibilities, because the future isn't predetermined. It's something we create together.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to bring this deep dive to a close. It's been a fascinating and honestly a little mind-bending journey.
Thanks for joining us. We hope this has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to do your own deep dive into these global trends.
Because the more we understand about the forces shaping our world, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the future, whatever it may hold. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.